GDP of every country. In this video, I have the GDP of every country, but the GDP of every single one of these countries is from 2021. So, because 2022 has not ended, so yeah, let's get into the video. So Afghanistan's GDP is 20.12 billion. Albania's GDP is 18.26 billion. Algeria's GDP is 168 billion. Andorra's GDP is 3.33 billion. Angola's GDP is 72.55 billion. Antigua and Barbuda's GDP is 1.471 billion. Argentina's GDP is 491.5 billion. Armenia's GDP is 13.86 billion. Australia's GDP is 1.543 trillion. Austria's GDP is 477.1 billion. Azerbaijan's GDP is 54.62 billion. Bahamas' GDP is 11.21 billion. Bahrain's GDP is 38.87 billion. Bangladesh's GDP is 416.3 billion. Barbados' GDP is 4.901 billion. Belarus's GDP is 68.22 billion. Belgium's GDP is 599.9 billion. Belize's GDP is 1.79 billion. Benin's GDP is 17.79 billion. Bhutan's GDP is 2.315 billion. Bolivia's GDP is 40.41 billion. Bosnia and Herzegovina's GDP is 22.57 billion. Botswana's GDP is 17.61 billion. Brazil's GDP is 1.609 trillion. Brunei's GDP is 14.01 billion. Bulgaria's GDP is 80.27 billion. Burkina Faso's GDP is 19.74 billion. Burundi's GDP is 2.902 billion. Cabo Verde's GDP is 1.936 billion. Cambodia's GDP is 26.96 billion. Cameroon's GDP is 45.24 billion. Canada's GDP is 1.991 trillion. Central African Republic's GDP is 2.516 billion. Chad's GDP is 11.78 billion. Chile's GDP is 317.1 billion. China's GDP is 17.73 trillion. Colombia's GDP is 314.3 billion. Comoros' GDP is 1.328 billion. Democratic Republic of the Congo's GDP is 53.96 billion. Costa Rica's GDP is 64.28 billion. Ivory Coast's GDP is 69.76 billion. Croatia's GDP is 67.84 billion. Cuba's GDP is 107.4 billion. Cyprus's GDP is 27.72 billion. Czech Republic or Czechia's GDP is 282.3 billion. Denmark's GDP is 397.1 billion. Djibouti's GDP is 3.371 billion. Dominica's GDP is 545.6 million, and this is the first country which economy is in the millions. Dominican Republic's GDP is 94.24 billion. Ecuador's GDP is 106.2 billion. Egypt's GDP is 404.1 billion. El Salvador's GDP is 28.74 billion. Equatorial Guinea's GDP is 12.27 billion. Eritrea's GDP is 2.065 billion. Estonia's GDP is 36.26 billion. Eswatini's GDP is 4.941 billion. Ethiopia's GDP is 112 billion. Fiji's GDP is 4.592 billion. Finland's GDP is 299.2 billion. France's GDP is 2.973 trillion. Gabon's GDP is 18.27 billion. Gambia's GDP is 2.078 billion. Georgia's GDP is 18.7 billion. Germany's GDP is 4.223 trillion, and Germany's is the highest economy in Europe. Ghana's GDP is 77.59 billion. Greece's GDP is 216.2 billion. Grenada's GDP is 1.122 billion. Guatemala's GDP is 86 billion. Guinea's GDP is 15.85 billion. Guinea-Bissau's GDP is 1.639 billion. Guyana's GDP is 7.409 billion. Haiti's GDP is 20.94 billion. Honduras' GDP is 28.49 billion. Hungary's GDP is 182.3 billion. Iceland's GDP is 25.46 billion. India's GDP is 3.173 trillion. Indonesia's GDP is 1.186 trillion. Iran's GDP is 240 billion. Iraq's GDP is 207.9 billion. Ireland's GDP is 498.6 billion. Israel's GDP is 481.6 billion. Italy's GDP is 2.1 trillion. Jamaica's GDP is 13.64 billion. Japan's GDP is 4.6 trillion. Jordan's GDP is 45.24 billion. Kazakhstan's GDP is 190.8 billion. Kenya's GDP is 110.3 billion. Kiribatis' GDP is 180.9 million. Kosovo's GDP is 9.242 billion. Kuwait's GDP is 106 billion. Kyrgyzstan's GDP is 8.543 billion. Laos's GDP is 18.83 billion. Latvia's GDP is 38.87 billion. Lebanon's GDP is 18.08 billion. Lesotho's GDP is 2.518 billion. Liberia's GDP is 3.487 billion. Libya's GDP is 41.88 billion. Liechtenstein's GDP is 6.3 billion. Lithuania's GDP is 65.5 billion. Luxembourg's GDP is 86.71 billion. Madagascar's GDP is 14.64 billion. Malawi's GDP is 12.63 billion. Malaysia's GDP is 372.7 billion. Maldives' GDP is 4.89 billion. Malawi's GDP is 19.14 million. Malta's GDP is 17.919 billion. Marshall Islands' GDP is 248.7 million. Mauritania's GDP is 8.228 billion. Mauritius' GDP is 11.16 billion. Mexico's GDP is 1.293 trillion. Micronesia's GDP is 404.2 million. Moldova's GDP is 13.68 billion. Monaco's GDP is 6.816 billion. Mongolia's GDP is 15.1 billion. Montenegro's GDP is 5.809 billion. Morocco's GDP is 132.7 billion. Mozambique's GDP is 16.1 billion. Myanmar's GDP is 65.07 billion. Namibia's GDP is 12.24 billion. Nauru's GDP is 133.2 million, which is the second lowest in the world, I think. Nepal's GDP is 36.29 billion. Netherlands' GDP is 1.018 trillion. New Zealand's GDP is 250 billion. Nicaragua's GDP is 14.01 billion. Niger's GDP is 14.95 billion. Nigeria's GDP is 440.8 billion, which is the highest in Africa. North Korea's GDP is 19 billion. North Macedonia's GDP is 13.88 billion. Norway's GDP is 482.4 billion. Oman's GDP is 85.87 billion. Pakistan's GDP is 346.3 billion. Palau's GDP is 257.7 billion. Panama's GDP is 63.61 billion. Papua New Guinea's GDP is 26.59 billion. Paraguay's GDP is 38.99 billion. Peru's GDP is 223.2 billion. The Philippines' GDP is 394.1 billion. Poland's GDP is 674 billion. Portugal's GDP is 249.9 billion. Qatar's GDP is 179.6 billion. Romania's GDP is 284.1 billion. Russia's GDP is 1.776 trillion. Rwanda's GDP is 11.07 billion. St. Kitts and Nevis' GDP is 976.2 million. St. Lucia's GDP is 1.765 billion. St. Vincent and the Grenadines' GDP is 889.8 million. Samoa's GDP is $788.4 million. San Marino's GDP is $1.545 billion. Sao Tome and Principe's GDP is $547.1 million. Saudi Arabia's GDP is $833.5 billion. Senegal's GDP is $27.63 billion. Serbia's GDP is $63.07 billion. Seychelles' GDP is $1.32 billion. Sierra Leone's GDP is $4.2 billion. Singapore's GDP is $397 billion. Slovakia's GDP is $114.9 billion. Slovenia's GDP is $61.53 billion. Solomon Islands' GDP is $1.645 billion. Somalia's GDP is $7.293 billion. South Africa's GDP is $419.9 billion. South Korea's GDP is $1.799 trillion. South Sudan's GDP is $5 billion. Spain's GDP is $1.425 trillion. Sri Lanka's GDP is $84.52 billion. Sudan's GDP is $34.33 billion. Suriname's GDP is $2.862 billion. Sweden's GDP is $627.4 billion. Switzerland's GDP is $812.9 billion. Syria's GDP is $21.45 billion. Tajikistan's GDP is $8.746 billion. Tanzania's GDP is $67.78 billion. Thailand's GDP is $506 billion. Timor-Leste's GDP is $1.959 billion. Togo's GDP is $8.413 billion. Tonga's GDP is $488.8 million. Trinidad and Tobago's GDP is $21.39 billion. Tunisia's GDP is $46.84 billion. Turkey's GDP is $815.3 billion. Turkmenistan's GDP is $45 billion. Tuvalu's GDP is $63.1 million, which is actually the lowest in the world of any economy. Uganda's GDP is $40.43 billion. Ukraine's GDP is $125 billion. United Arab Emirates' GDP is $358.9 billion. UK's GDP is $3.187 trillion. USA's GDP is $23 trillion, which is the highest in the world. Uruguay's GDP is $59.32 billion. Uzbekistan's GDP is $69.24 billion. Vanuatu's GDP is $983.5 million. Vatican City's GDP is $10 to $15 billion. Venezuela's GDP is $150 billion. Vietnam's GDP is $362.6 billion. Yemen's GDP is $25 billion. Zambia's GDP is $21.2 billion. And finally, Zimbabwe's GDP is $26.22 billion.